It's a great fall day in the garden. I'm Liz Davey, and you're watching A Walk in the Garden on NCTV. These programs are filmed in my garden throughout the seasons, the changing of the seasons, and after the frost that we had 2 nights ago. It's the end of October, so it's time for frost. Anyway, that was a killing frost for me, at least, for in most areas. Even up close to the house, my plants did get tinged with the frost. So that means it's time for quite a bit of work in the garden, starting our cleanup. As you can see, I still have plenty of leaves on the trees, although the pine cones and the pine needles are falling freely. I have a lot of pine trees, and they are shedding, and this is a banner year for pine cones. I have enough pine cones, I think, to make a wreath for everyone in Norfolk. I'm cleaning them up gradually, but they need to be cleaned up before the lawn can be mowed, which is, otherwise they clog up the lawn more pretty badly, so we don't want to keep them on the ground. So it's a combination of raking and mowing and then cleanup of gardens. I'm in the herb garden, and our herb harvest is pretty much ended. We do have some chives left that can be picked. They're pretty hardy, but most of the others have been singed by the frost. Of course, sage is still available. We can still pick sage and thyme right through Thanksgiving. In fact, right until it's covered with snow. I will cut back a few of these items. This is tarragon, and as you can see, it doesn't even have any leaves. It has a little basal growth underneath. We'll leave that. That forms the basis for next year's plants. So tarragon and oreganos, I will cut back. But a number of the plants I will leave. Of course, I'll leave the sage. This is another oregano, which I could probably still pick a little bit before it's completely gone. Again, the tarragon's gone. We have a few sticks in here too from the wind. But I'll leave the lavender. I will leave all the thymes. I don't cut those back. The southern wood stays. The rue may or may not get cut back. Most of the mints I will cut back. And the lemon balm, this is to prevent disease from coming in and staying this winter. You don't want it to be too heavily foliaged so that dampness sets in and causes fungal disease. But I will be leaving the other southern wood, and of course the sage and the chives, and we'll have an early, they will just die back naturally. So much of this will stay as it is. It's good to leave things, and a few leaves too, just to cover the ground and provide a home for the butterflies that form chrysalises or even their caterpillars that will stay in the garden over the winter. Some insects too, some of the beneficial insects. We all know about the monarch butterfly that goes south for the winter, but not all of them do. Monarchs are kind of an exception. Many of them stay in some form right here in the garden, and where they like to be is down in among the fallen leaves and stems of the flowers. Another thing I'll do is pick up, and that means signs, my weather, my clock there, my old-fashioned clock, and my labels for my plants. It keeps them looking nice a little bit longer. If you do have labels on your plants that you pick up, make sure you know where the plants are. I've been doing this garden for quite a long time, and I'm pretty sure what each plant looks like as it comes up. But if I didn't know and put in a lot of new things, I'd make a diagram and list where things are before I pulled these stakes out, so I wouldn't be wondering next spring, oh, what's that coming up? The other thing I'd like to do is pull any annual herbs, and that would be this basil that's completely gone. And there's some more basil over here. I don't have too many annual herbs, but the few that I have I will pull. That would include the scented geraniums and the lemon verbena and of course the basil. They've gone by, and I don't want to be confused thinking something's going to come up there next spring when it won't come up because they were annuals to begin with. That's pretty much my fall chores in this garden, at least right now. We may have a few more as the season wears on. Now let's move over to the perennial garden and see what's going on over there. Again, when I'm over here in the perennial garden, I'm under the grapevines right now, which have lost all of their foliage and grapes. The grapes have been harvested, of course, and the foliage will just stay there. One of the things I can do is to tack down some of this foliage so it won't break this winter if we intend to keep it. If you're going to prune it off anyway, it doesn't really matter. Any bird houses that have been used, and I have one back here, need to be cleaned out. And this one has a nest. I'm not going to clean it right now. Before I clean a birdhouse, I wear gloves, and I also wear a mask because some birds carry avian diseases that can cause a lung disease in humans. So it's always good to wear a mask when you're cleaning out old bird nests. Bird baths. They need to be dismantled. This is an old-fashioned type with the top. If you have a nice ceramic one, you might want to even bring it inside, especially those that sit low to the ground. You don't want water to freeze in one of these. If it does, it will probably crack the bird bath and break it. So I just take it off and set it next to the column that it sits on, and it passes the winter that way, and at least water can drain out of it. In the perennial garden, we have lots of things that can be cut back. The old lily stalks can be cut down somewhat. Some things are still green, and some things have what's called basal foliage, and that's foliage at the bottom of the plant. The stalks have since died above, but this foliage that persists, you need to leave. Again, we have some annual things. Those can be either left or pulled. This is a Verbena bonariensis, and it's forming seed. Well, I'd like to propagate that around the garden, and often the seed will grow next year, depending on how hard our winter is. So I'm going to leave that until the seeds have formed and then scatter them throughout the garden. It is an annual plant, but it's what's called a reseeding annual. There are several categories of plant care getting ready for winter. The easiest is the perennials. They'll come back next year, so just leave them alone. If you have really tender ones, you can put a little mulch on top. Otherwise, they'll be just fine, and they'll come back. Potted plants. These are annuals that I've potted. This is a Nicotiana, and it will just get dumped. It's ready, and it'll go into the compost. Again, some of the stalks I'll cut back, others I'll just leave, again, for the overwintering butterflies and beneficial insects. This is a Eupatorium chocolate. It's got nice chocolate foliage. It had nice white blooms. They're no longer there, but the seed pods are rather decorative. And again, that one will come back next year just fine without any help. I have a goldenrod, and I'll probably cut this one back simply because I would like a little goldenrod, but I don't want a lot of goldenrod. So these, at least the bloom heads, will come right off and probably get trashed instead of even going in the compost. This will seed very readily if just left to its own devices. I generally cut back my irises and anything else that gets gooey. And by gooey, I mean in the spring, they become kind of gelatinous, and I really don't enjoy cleaning those up in the spring, so I cut them now, just to prevent that. It's all right to leave them, but I just prefer to remove a few things like that. The other types of flowers are those that are in bulb form, and they need to come inside, and we'll see a few of those down near the vegetable garden. Again, we have some things going to seed. This is butterfly weed, the brilliant orange flowers that the monarchs love. It's going to seed like crazy. Each seed has its own little aerial boost with this lovely fluffy white hair, I guess you'd call it, and they will fly all over the place and reseed. That's how they spread their seed, far and wide. I'm going to interrupt that a little bit and pick some of these and take them in so that I can plant them in the spring and have seedlings to put where I want them rather than where it wants to go, which in many cases is the lawn and other places where we don't want it. The roses are finished. I did not pick the last blooms on this rose. I have another rose on the other side that still has a bloom hanging on. And again, I haven't picked them or cut them back after they've bloomed. We want the roses to say, winter is coming, I'm getting ready. And the formation of these rose hips, however small they are, tells the rose it's time to get ready for winter and harden off and not put on too much new growth. We have a little bit of new growth. It's the new growth that will die back if you start cutting things back now. Any pruning, I don't do much winter pruning because often we get some warmer days. If I were to prune right now at the end of October and we get a few really warm days, the plant will say, oh, it's spring, it's time to grow again. And some new growth will start. And then all of a sudden, it gets cold again and that new growth dies back. So I usually wait to prune until late winter or after things bloom if they're spring blooming plants. I know many landscapers will prune in the fall. I suspect it's because that's when they have time to do the work. But I prefer to wait and prune the fall blooming plants in the spring, early spring, and the ones that have bloomed in the spring right after they've bloomed, so early summer. Again, we have lots of seed pods for the birds and the butterflies, which will nest. And this is an example of a plant with basal foliage. It's a black-eyed Susan, and we want to, even if we cut the pods off, leave the basal foliage because that's the formation for the plants for next year. A few annuals in here have gone by, and we're going to add those to the compost. And remember, you can pick grasses and pods for fall arrangements. I've picked a few for some fall arrangements, and I will be picking more. I'm not going to pick any of this for a fall arrangement, though, because I really don't want all of this cottony growth all over the house. And these seed pods will burst if picked now and brought in. And you'll have a cleanup job to do. The same is true of cattails. They look really pretty, but if you have ever had one explode in the house, you won't be bringing them in anymore. Peonies will get cut down. Peonies are very prone to fungal diseases, and you don't want them to spread. There's a little black on this one. Those I will cut down and discard the foliage. I won't even add it to the compost. Anything that has a problem should not be added to your compost because that'll just spread the problem when you spread the compost out on your plants. We still have some mums in bloom. Chrysanthemums, these have been here 3 or 4 years. And people say, well, chrysanthemums never come back. That is very true if you buy them in the fall. But if you want chrysanthemums that will come back, you need to buy the plants in the spring. And that usually means a mail order plant. There are several chrysanthemums that are dependable, but almost all of the ones labeled hardy chrysanthemums, if planted in the spring, can be brought back into bloom several times and then divided up and planted elsewhere. So again, make a note to look for chrysanthemum starts in the spring. They come as very small starts, but they develop quite quickly into a full-size plant. And then they'll come back almost every year. They eventually give out, but they aren't like the ones you buy in the supermarket right now that last maybe until Thanksgiving and then are completely gone. Again, we have plenty of pods to pick. This is a red twig dogwood. Right now I'm planning my holiday decorations and what I want to save to pick to put in them. This will turn progressively redder as the season wears on, and it makes a nice accent to outdoor and indoor winter arrangements. The same is true of the Sedum Autumn Joy. It's a lovely reddish color right now. It will become a little more burgundy in tone, almost brown, but it still adds a lot to arrangements, inside and out. So I will leave that for sure in the garden and pick it gradually to add to things like window boxes and other winter arrangements. Hollies, evergreens, there are lots of things you can pick in your yard to use in floral arrangements. And some of the pods are also nice. Spray paint works wonders on things like this, and you have little gold balls. So be aware of that as you clean up the garden and see what you can find to add to arrangements throughout the season. Now let's move over to the vegetable garden. With the frost, a lot of the annual flowers browned completely. They were black when I came out, and so they've been pulled and they're being added to the compost pile. We still have plenty of things to pick in the garden though, which may be a surprise to some people who think it, once the tomatoes are gone, that's the end of it. The tomatoes are indeed gone, as are the peppers and the eggplants, most of the lettuce, and some of the other greens. But we still have Brussels sprouts, which will be picked shortly. They stand up to quite a bit of frost, and I have a number of plants. Some of them are a little small, but they're still very tasty. The broccoli, I've cut back. We had a meal of broccoli this week, and we may well get broccoli until Thanksgiving. New broccoli shoots will form. I keep cutting it back and new little shoots form. They aren't huge heads, but you can make a meal out of a lot of smaller pieces. I have plenty of parsley left. Some of this I will bring in and put in glass jars to keep it in the refrigerator, and it will last probably until Christmas that way. Again, you wash it, dry it slightly, and then put it, while it's damp, into a glass jar. Plastic does not work, and it will completely disintegrate in plastic, but in glass it will last quite a long time. I have plenty of kale, and this is a lancenato kale. I also have a curly kale, and both of these actually benefit from the frost. They become sweeter in flavor, as do the Brussels sprouts, so a frost is really good for those. We still have some of the perpetual spinach, which can be picked and used as you would spinach. This is the curly kale. And then we have arugula, which is a very hardy green. It comes up early in the spring if you seed it, and it will last well into fall if you keep picking it. I also have a little Swiss chard left, and there is some lettuce here, but it's not looking too good. I think it's been nibbled a little bit, and that will probably be dug up and discarded. We have some carrots to dig and parsnips to dig. I have very few beets left, and they're very small, but they still can be cooked and consumed. And these were the straw flowers that I planted. Most of them I harvested and brought inside, but again, they're gone now. They have some basal foliage, but they won't bloom anymore, so they too can be added to the compost. This is what the border of marigolds looked like when I came out 2 days ago. Completely blackened by the frost. You know you have a frost if you have marigolds, because they will go right away. And those will just be picked and put into the compost. But we aren't done planting yet. Now it's the time to plant some garlic. And I've turned over a little spot here that was empty. Some flowers had been in this spot. And I'm going to make a trench and clear out any roots that are there. And I've ordered some garlic to plant. I could also have used garlic from last year had I had any left, and I do have some, but I'm planning to consume it. So I'm using new garlic, and basically it comes, I bought just 3 cloves, but that's going to produce a whole row of garlic eventually. And to plant garlic, what we want to do is separate the cloves. And I may need to use my clippers on this one, which are here. And we want to separate out these cloves as best we can. These are tightly packed. And we can peel them down a little bit. There we go. And you can see they're fairly large cloves. So it should produce garlic with the same type of cloves. And I'm going to plant these with the point up about 6 inches apart. Each one of these cloves will turn into a head of garlic about next July. And then we'll just cover them over. Pat it down well. And I'll continue this process all the way down. And then I'll cover the whole row with straw. Loosen it up a little bit. And it may come up a little bit this fall if we have some warmer days, or it may wait till spring. It just depends on the weather. If it comes up in the fall, no harm is done. It'll come up again next spring, and we'll look for this next spring. I do put the straw on. It kind of helps it, and it provides a mulch next spring when it starts to come up. It also keeps the person rototilling the garden from tilling it up this fall. So it marks the spot. I'll probably leave string there too. These are parsnips, and I will be harvesting these very soon. Again, they sweeten up after a frost. We'll harvest the parsnips, and then I'll finish planting my row of garlic. I like to get it in before the end of October, or at least the early part of November. So finishing some cleanup here, getting the garlic in, and continuing to pick things. And then around Thanksgiving, the garden will be ready to be tilled. Hopefully we don't have snow by then, or the tilling may have to wait until spring. Some other things to do would be to pick the tender bulbs. And that would be the canna lilies. And did I leave my clippers over here? Yes. Canna lilies and dahlias. They go once the frost hits them, but we want to save those bulbs to be planted again next spring. So I'm going to cut them off about 1 inch from the end. And again, we'll be composting healthy foliage from these. And then the pitchfork comes into play. And this has to be done somewhat carefully. You want to get the corm out, but you don't want to break it and cut into it. And this is the canna. And these are the growing heads, the white parts. We did break off one of them, I see. And these can be, what I'll do is save this in the shed for a while. There's another eye right here, or two. These form eyes, and these are growing eyes. This will probably make 3 or 4 plants next year. You want to get out as many as you can. These are the growing points or eyes, and each will make a new plant. And these I will put in my shed to dry and cure a little bit. And then they will be stored in the coolest place I have that doesn't freeze. That would be an unused guest room. If I have guests, I have to move them, but most of the time it stays a lot cooler there than any place else. You don't want them to freeze. A basement, unheated basement is ideal, but I don't have one, so I make do with the best I can. We'll do the same with this lovely dahlia. And it has a lot of foliage for a few corms. And again, we'll get rid of the foliage first, at least most of it. There's several plants in here. And we'll just dig one of them. And I had supports around them. Those will be packed away, as will all the supports from the perennial garden. They can be brought out next spring. And again, we will carefully attempt to dig this without damaging it too much. I have a few dahlias in containers as well. These can go fairly deep, so. And again, I want to get them as much soil off as possible. Have another piece to cut. You can see the flowers were still there last week, but they're gone now. And this can be divided, and we can grow 3 or 4 different plants at least, because each of the eyes that you see will next year give new plants. Again, these will go in the shed for now. Then they will come into the house once they've dried. And I'll repeat that with all of the cannas and dahlias I have. Put them in a box with a little peat moss and try to keep them over the winter. It usually works out fairly well. The cannas seem to be very hardy and can just be put in a crate or loosely stored. You don't want them tightly stored. You wouldn't want to put them in a plastic bag. They would mold for sure because there's still some moisture in them. About February, I'll check them. If they look really dry, I might spritz them with a little water. And then in April, we can get them out and get them started. And we'll have some lovely dahlias and cannas for next year. Now let's go plant a few more things. Some spring bulbs. I always get carried away and order a lot of spring blooming bulbs. I really love them and love to see them coming up in the spring. Finding places for them is sometimes difficult, but I have an area here that does need spring bulbs, and I'm going to start by planting some daffodils. Others I have not arrived yet, but I do have a variety of tulips and daffodils and crocuses, hyacinths. Spring bulbs are the greatest. And you want to plant them deep, so it does take some work. I forget that when it comes time to order them. And I'm going to dig out as much as I can. I'd like to get these at least 6 to 7 inches down. A good rule of thumb is 3 times the height of the bulb. If you can get it down that low, that's a really good thing to do. Tulips do not come back well. Hyacinths, daffodils, and crocuses do pretty well. The chipmunks and rabbits are very happy with tulips and crocuses. But they don't like daffodils, and neither do the deer. So that makes daffodils a really good choice for our area. I'm trying to get some of these rocks out of here. We seem to have a lot. And I'm going to put in 5 rosy cloud daffodils. These are a double, and they have some pink. And they tell you to plant them further apart. I like to plant them close. They may not last as long, but you get a nice clumping of them when they're planted fairly close. Other bulbs, such as some of the crocuses, I can plant further apart because they tend to spread. And again, we've got lots of rocks, which we'll make a little pile of those and try to get some good soil over them. I don't add fertilizer at this point in the process. We want them to spread out their roots in the soil that's here. You may wish to add a light mulch. Usually a coating of leaves will take care of that. And the daffodils are quite hardy and should do just fine. And we should be able to enjoy this area next spring. I do want to mark where I've planted them because I intend to put in more bulbs. I'll use some of these rocks temporarily so that I will know where I've already planted something and won't dig them up again. Hopefully in the spring, when the bulbs were in bloom, you took a few pictures and made a few notes, and now you'll know when those bulbs come in where to plant them. I did that. I have pictures that I took, and I'll be consulting those for the rest of the garden to see where there are areas that could use a little spring color, and that's where I'll put the bulbs that are due to come in any time. And by Thanksgiving, they will all be planted, and we'll be waiting for them to come up. The bulbs will grow over the winter. They'll put down roots and grow and then be ready to send up their shoots and their flowers in the spring. And we should have bulbs from about the first part of April right on through May. So something to look forward to as you do the fall cleanup. Now let's head back to the shade garden. These were the lovely impatiens that I put in the pots. A frost turns them completely to mush. So into the bucket they go, and we'll wash out our container and have it all ready for next spring, and these will go into the compost. I have a few impatiens here and there in the garden, and they too will get pulled and added to the compost. We don't have quite as much work to do back here cutting things down. I will cut down the hosta as they go, and they're pretty much gone. But all of the hellebores and the ferns, I'll just leave where they are. Most of my ferns will just kind of normally dissolve into the background. The hellebores will stay green all winter. And I will also put in some marks so that when we run the snowblower down the path to my garden shed, we don't run over them. So it's time to start thinking about putting in those snow poles to keep yourself from running over things that you really don't want to run over. The pond is covered with a net, which helps keep the leaves out. It's not 100%. Some of them always get in. And that's why I've left my skimmer going, and my waterfall and filter are also going. But these two, as the days become shorter and the nights get colder, I will remove. I need to also cut down the one plant that stays in the pond throughout the season. And then I'll leave the net on until we've finished cleaning up all the leaves. And then once the net comes off for winter, I will be able to put my little ice melter in. This keeps a hole in the ice so that the fish, the gases that are expired by the fish, even though they're moving pretty slowly, we want to have a hole to have the gases that are produced by the fish and any waste decomposing. It needs a way to get out of the pond. So that's why you want to keep a little hole in the pond if you have fish. I have been feeding on warm days a fall food, which is very easily digestible. They're moving around pretty well still. The fishes go into kind of a suspended animation, and once the water temperature goes below 50 degrees, I stop feeding them altogether, between 40 and 50. They don't digest the food well, so it's kind of a waste of food to put it in. They don't eat much anyway. So we'll stop feeding them for the winter, start again when the temperature rises above 50 in the spring. I don't leave the net on all winter because it tends to get matted down with snow. I tried it one year and it was not a very successful experience. So once the leaves are gone, I can take it down and do a little scooping of leaves to try to keep it cleaned up a little bit. Some people will lower the water level a little. I usually leave it where it is and just let it go. As far as the shed goes, I've removed everything that would freeze. That includes some of the plant chemicals and insect sprays and deer spray. Although we keep the deer spray handy, the deer are still around and they do eat in the winter. And I'll need to spray some things every once in a while. Rhododendrons, azaleas, and particularly the holly. I don't know why they like the spiny holly, but they do. So if I want to keep it, I do have to spray it in order to keep the deer out. Of course, the hosta foliage will be gone, so they won't be bothering that anymore. Another thing I need to do is set some mouse traps or put in some Mouse Magic, which is a mint product, to help discourage mice from setting up shop in my shed. There's no way you can keep them out completely in an outdoor shed, it seems, so we will just try to discourage them from coming in the first place. Let's go inside now and see what we can do with what's left of the harvest and have some Halloween fun. Today I'm going to prepare some treats for Halloween, maybe a Halloween supper or just some Halloween fun or a Halloween party. Actually, I will probably be making some of these items again next week for my grandchildren's Halloween party. They're teenagers and teenagers eat a lot, so I said I would help contribute to their party effort. Today I've browned a pound of ground beef and poured off the fat, extra fat, and I'm going to add a half a cup of onions. What I'm making is what from the Midwest I call sloppy joes. In Rhode Island I understand it's called dynamites, and I think it is sometimes called barbecued beef. I think it has a variety of names, but it's the same stuff. Basically, it's browned beef with some onion, and we'll use some celery, and then add some spices as we go along. And I want to brown this a little bit more with the onion, just to get the onion a little cooked, and then we'll add some other things. And I have some spices to add too. You don't want to forget anything here. We're going to add some celery as well, about a quarter cup of celery, and again a half cup of onions and a pound of ground beef. This is just a basic ground beef mixture. If you add some macaroni and a can of tomatoes to something like this, you have American chop suey, or as my mother called it, goulash. Again, different areas have different names for things. And I'm going to add some ketchup, 2/3 of a cup. A tablespoon of brown sugar, 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, and I want to add some salt. Again, this is kind of up to you. The recipe that I had called for 1.5 teaspoons. I'm adding about 1/2 teaspoon. We just don't eat as much salt. 1.5 teaspoons of Worcestershire sauce. And again, I'm going to guess on the half. A teaspoon of vinegar, and I'll use cider vinegar. And a 1/4 teaspoon of dry mustard. I suspect that you could add regular yellow mustard and a little more than a 1/4 teaspoon if you wanted to. We're going to mix this around and keep it heating. Now I'm going to put a lid on it and we're going to let it simmer about 1/2 hour or more or less. We want to keep it on fairly low and just let it simmer away. And while it's simmering, we'll make a few other things. I'm going to make a Halloween pumpkin cheese ball. And I've got a softened package of cream cheese. And to that, I'm going to add 1.5 cups of shredded cheddar cheese. Pick up a few dishes. And 1/2 cup of chopped chives from the garden. We still have them. I'm going to mix this around well. Make sure I get everything mixed in. It's pretty simple as far as the ingredients go. Then I'm going to put on my gloves because this is going to be kind of messy. And put the mixture out onto a piece of wax paper. Again, to try to keep the mess a little minimal. Make sure I get all of the cheese. And I'll get a plate to put it on. And I formed somewhat of a pumpkin shape, but I'm going to take a butter knife and kind of make some ridges down the sides to kind of make it look a little more like a pumpkin. You could double the recipe if you wanted a larger cheese ball. Just double all the ingredients. Then the last thing I'm going to do is I put some cheese puffs through the food processor because it doesn't look much like a pumpkin right now. But I'm going to cover it with these cheese puffs to give it a nice orange coating. I'm making a big mess here. And then I'll put it on our plate, and then I'll finish it off with the top from a green pepper. And this gives it the look of a pumpkin stem. And we'll add a few crackers, and we have a little holiday pumpkin cheese ball, and we can serve that with a spreader. And that's an hors d'oeuvre for the Halloween party. Now let's make some sweet treats. I baked up a batch of dark chocolate cookies, and these are a recipe that I found on the King Arthur website, so there's no big secret there if you want to make them. They're called chocolate wafers, and they're very dark chocolate. They use black chocolate and then regular chocolate. And I'm going to use some prepackaged things to embellish a few nice little sweet treats. And these are eyes. They're found at craft stores, and they're made out of frosting. They're edible eyes, and I also have some pretzel sticks. So I can work with some other things. Let's see, I need another spreader, which disappeared somewhere. We'll use this. Anyway, I'm going to use some peanut butter cups. And I've taken them out of their packages. That's probably the hardest thing about making these items. And these are I used cookie cutters. My cookie cutter collection is probably too large, but I do like them, and I keep buying them. They're a nice little thing to buy when you go someplace and want a little souvenir. And some of them are quite old. I think some of them I acquired from my aunt, who would be well over 100 years old now. So I have a big collection. Black cat, I made a few of those. I made a few pumpkin shapes. This could also be an apple if you were so inclined. And then I made a few rounds, which I cut in half. And these are going to be bat wings. So just a round cutter works fine for that. I also have some little hors d'oeuvre cutters, and I use those to make a face on my pumpkins. So you can use what you have, not always in the same way that it was intended. And the little pumpkins, I'm using a little orange frosting on plain ones, and then topping them with faces that have been cut out. Again, I made the frosting that I tinted orange. You could use purchased frosting. I'm sure there's plenty of it out there at this time. And so I have some little pumpkins. And I thought I'd use the gold plate just to accent them a little. My bat wings I'm going to use with peanut butter cups. And these are pretty simple. We're just going to stick a bat wing, 2 bat wings in, and then put on 2 eyes. Poke them in a little bit. They stick pretty well. And we have some bats. We'll make a few of those. Again, once you have the things you need for them, they're pretty simple to put together. Oops. Poke it a little harder. These little eyes are fun. They can be added to most anything. It helps if you have the black part up. So we have bats and pumpkins. Do another bat here. Those are pretty simple. I did some cats, plain black cats, and rather than frosting them, which admittedly takes time, I'm just going to use a toothpick to add 2 eyes. No need to get out any fancy decorating. You can if you wish, but again, keeping it simple, I'll just add some eyes. Whiskers would be another option, I suppose. We'll do about 4 of each. And the last thing I'm going to do is the simplest yet, and it is witch's brooms. And these are the smaller peanut butter cups, which I'll just put out on the plate. And I'll use a pretzel stick for a broomstick. And you have something that's a little sweet and a little salty and pretty tasty. And witch's brooms. So there we have a few Halloween treats, and I have one more that I've made, and that is a refrigerator cookie. Now this is one of my Halloween standbys, I guess you'd say. And you'll notice I have a roll of dough, and it has a center that's chocolate. How I did that was to make the brown sugar, it's a brown sugar sugar cookie dough, and I put about 1/3 of it, pulled it out, and added 1½ squares of unsweetened chocolate. And that I rolled out the light colored dough to about 4 inches wide and about 10 inches long, and then made a cylinder of the chocolate dough, which I rolled into the middle. I think you could do the same thing with purchased sugar cookie dough and probably come out with the same thing. Then I wrapped it and put it in the refrigerator. And now I'm going to slice them off in about 1/4 inch slices. Put 3 or 4 out. And these will be paired on the cookie sheet and kind of squeezed together. I'm going to make some owls. And that usually has kind of a flat side, and those work together pretty well. And you want to pinch it a little bit so that they stay together. I'll move this back so you can see what I'm doing, maybe a little bit more. Then I'm going to pinch up the corners to make ears for my owls. And again, make sure to kind of keep them together so they don't separate, although the cook gets to eat those that do. So Then we'll add chocolate chips for the eyes. And a whole cashew for a beak. And these make little owls. These will go into the oven at 350 for about 8 or 9 minutes. And this is how they turn out. Pretty much the way they looked when they went in, which are little owl cookies. Now let's see if our Sloppy Joe is ready to serve. And I think it is. This can be served on buns or English muffins, and I'm going to put some on English muffins today. You can make it ahead and reheat it, which makes for a very quick meal if you're out trick-or-treating early. Again, I'm going to add a little bit to each bun. A pound of meat will probably make 4 generous servings, so if you have more to serve, just double up the recipe. And sloppy it is. Getting it on the plate as well. I'll pick up what, get a paper towel and clean up a little. And because it's Halloween, I'm going to do something a little different with these. Often you serve it with a whole bun on top too. But today I thought I would do a little something again with my cookie cutters. And I'm going to use some white cheese and make ghosts to put on top of each one. I'm using the cutter, and it almost fits. There's a little bit of the tail that does not. And we can remove the scrap. And that can be used melted perhaps. And then I'm using a decorating tube to make little eyes in it. And then we'll put a ghost on each one. And I already have a few already cut. And we're ready for Halloween. Thank you for joining me today on A Walk in the Garden. I'm Liz Davey, and you've been watching this show on NCTV, Norfolk Community Cable Television.